Nikko Jenkins, a man whose name still sends chills across the country, sitting in a cell no bigger than a parking space, 23 hours a day, staring at the same four concrete walls, medicated against his own will, carving snakes into his skin with sharpened tile fragments, surviving his own suicide attempts over and over again. Not because anyone is saving him out of mercy, but because the system needs him alive just enough to keep punishing him. And before this video is over, you're going to have to ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. Is this justice? Or is what they're doing to Nikko Jenkins actually worse than death itself? On May 30th, 2017, a Douglas County courtroom in Omaha, Nebraska went completely silent as a three-judge panel delivered the verdict that would define the rest of Nikko Jenkins' life. 4 death sentences stacked back to back, plus an additional 450 to 500 years for weapons charges alone. A sentence so enormous it barely fits inside a single hearing. But what the cameras captured that day, the face tattoos, the muttering about Egyptian serpent gods, the theatrical courtroom outbursts, was only the surface of a story that goes so much deeper and so much darker than most people ever bothered to look at. Stay with me, because where this story actually goes will completely change how you think about punishment, mental illness, and the broken machinery that created a killer, and then pretend to be surprised. To understand what death row is doing to Nikko Jenkins today, you first have to understand what he actually did and why the state of Nebraska decided 4 deaths weren't enough. They wanted 5, counting his. In August 2013, just 12 days after his release from a 10-year prison sentence, Jenkins murdered 4 people in 10 days. Jorge Cajiga Ruiz, 29 years old, an immigrant who worked hard to support his family, was shot dead in a park at 3 o'clock in the morning. Juan Uribe Pena, 26, killed beside him. Both men lured to a dark, wooded area under false pretenses and executed with a shotgun by someone who would later describe their deaths as ritual sacrifices to an Egyptian serpent deity named Apophis. Curtis Bradford, 22, was trying to rebuild his life after his own time in prison. He had even taken a photograph with Jenkins just hours before Jenkins shot him in the head and chest and left him under a streetlight like he was nothing. And then there was Andrea Kruger, 33 years old, a bartender and mother of 3, who was driving home from a late shift when Jenkins forced her car to stop, dragged her out, and fired at close range. Her 3 children waited at home, for a mother never walked through the door again. These are not footnotes. These are the center of everything, and we cannot lose sight of them no matter how complicated the rest of this story gets. Now, here's what you probably did not know, and this is the part that should genuinely disturb you. Before any of those murders happened, Nikko Jenkins sat inside a Nebraska prison and wrote letters to officials begging for psychiatric help. He told a prison psychiatrist directly, "If you release me without treatment, I will kill people." His warnings were dismissed. The Nebraska Department of Corrections released him without completing the mandatory mental health evaluation his own sentence required. And 12 days later, 4 people were dead. The system that created the monster was now going to punish the monster while quietly hoping no one did the math too loudly. So, what does death row actually look like for Nikko Jenkins? Not in theory, but in the actual living reality of every single day. Tecumseh State Correctional Institution sits on the flat, wind-beaten plains of southeast Nebraska, built to contain the state's most dangerous men. Jenkins wakes up every morning in a single cell, concrete floor, steel door, fluorescent lighting that never changes regardless of the time of day, and he spends 23 hours inside it. 1 hour a day, he is allowed into a fenced cage outside, alone under constant watch. Meals arrive not through a window, not through a conversation, through a slot in the steel door 3 times a day, the only thing that breaks the rhythm of silence. And this is not a temporary situation. This is every day, with no visible end date anywhere on the horizon. But it gets even more unsettling than isolation alone. Jenkins has made 19 documented suicide attempts since arriving on death row, slashing his own throat in 2018, cutting his eyes and neck in 2019, and continuing in the years since with makeshift blades sharpened from tile fragments he chips off his own cell wall. Guards patch him back together, and he returns to the same cell, the same door, the same ceiling, where he then claims to receive visions from his serpent god Apophis. A medical panel of experts has now voted 4 separate times, unanimously, to involuntarily administer antipsychotic medication to Jenkins just to keep his mind stable enough to survive death row. Think about that for a moment. The same institution that once dismissed his mental health concerns as inconvenient paperwork now forcibly medicates him just to keep him functional enough to be punished. And even through the medication, he spends his hours scratching new tattoos into his skin with contraband tools. Snakes, hieroglyphs, the word dawn, feeding obsessions that prosecutors argued were pure performance, but that defense attorneys argued were the very evidence of a mind catastrophically fractured long before anyone gave him a gun. Which brings us to where Nikko Jenkins came from, because death row did not create him. It was just the final stop on a road that started decades earlier and never once offered him a safe exit. He was born on September 16, 1986, and grew up in North Omaha in a family that carried over 600 criminal convictions across relatives. Theft, violence, drugs, chaos stretching back through generations like a curse that nobody knew how to break. His father cycled in and out of jail like it was routine. His mother battled addiction and instability. By age 7, he walked into his elementary school with a loaded handgun hidden among his school supplies. 7 years old, already convinced the world was dangerous enough to require a weapon just to get through the day. By age 8, he had been hospitalized for self-harm and severe emotional instability. Foster care followed, group homes followed, and instead of healing him, the system just kept moving him from one place to the next. At 15, he committed a robbery with a knife. At 16, he was sentenced to 10 years in adult prison, and that prison did not fix what was broken. It deepened it. Inside that prison, Jenkins accumulated over 100 disciplinary infractions and was placed into extended solitary confinement. 23 hours a day alone in a cell, no meaningful human contact, no grounding, just silence, and a mind left completely alone to collapse inward. It was there, in that silence, that the voice of Apophis first appeared, commanding human sacrifice, demanding blood. Whether that voice was a genuine psychotic break or a calculated mythology he built around himself to survive, the most honest answer may be that both things can be true at once, and neither answer changes the damage it eventually caused. Now, here is where the story takes its most recent turn, and it is genuinely strange. In March 2025, Jenkins sent a handwritten note to the courts asking them to drop all remaining appeals and let his execution proceed immediately. He wanted to die, he said so plainly with no ambiguity. Then, just weeks later, he reversed course completely, appearing in court barely coherent while his attorneys pushed for new psychological evaluations and a full review of his case. The man who begged for death was now fighting to delay it, and the reason matters. His IQ is tested around 68, and under the Supreme Court's ruling in Atkins v. Virginia, executing someone with an intellectual disability is unconstitutional. If his attorneys can make that argument stick, it would remove the death sentence entirely. Not through innocence, not through exoneration, but because the very system that neglected his developing mind as a child may now be constitutionally barred from ending his life as a consequence of that neglect. And then there is the pharmaceutical problem that makes all of this even more surreal. Nebraska has not executed a single inmate since 2018 because pharmaceutical companies have refused to supply the drugs required for lethal injection. The machinery of execution has, for now, simply stopped working, which means Nikko Jenkins, a man who once desperately wanted the needle, sits on death row unable to receive it. Not this year, maybe not ever, surrounded by 10 other condemned men in the same limbo, in the same fluorescent-lit hallway that smells like disinfectant and where every door is made of steel. This is not what justice looks like in a movie, clean, final, resolved. This is what it looks like in real life. A man sentenced to death who is not dying, not free, not healing, not punished in any way that society can clearly point to and call finished. He is in a state of continuous psychological collapse, stitched back together just enough to keep existing, then pulled back to the edge again in an endless loop that nobody designed on purpose, but nobody has figured out how to stop. No cellmate, no meaningful human contact, forced medication, self-inflicted wounds, 19 documented suicide attempts, a fractured mind spinning in solitary. While the families of Jorge, Juan, Curtis, and Andrea wait for a justice that keeps getting delayed by pharmaceutical shortages, incompetency hearings, and constitutional arguments. Jorge Cajiga Ruiz never came home from that park. Juan Uribe Pena never had another quiet night. Curtis Bradford never got his second chance. Andrea Kruger's children grew up without their mother, and no verdict, no appeal, no lethal injection, and no amount of courtroom theater will ever change any of that. Nikko Jenkins is not at peace on death row. He is not resting. He is in a torment that no clean legal language fully captures. A living punishment inside a punishment, medicated, isolated, scarring his own skin, flipping between begging for death and fighting to survive, trapped in a system that can neither execute him on schedule nor offer him anything else. Some men do not get an ending. They get an existence, and for Nikko Jenkins, that existence, day after day, in a room that was never designed to hold a human soul, but does it anyway. Maybe the closest thing to hell that actually exists on this earth. Now, tell me in the comments, is this justice? Or did the system that built Nikko Jenkins also build the cage that proves it was never capable of delivering the justice it promised?